There's something about high school that sticks with you, even years later. It's the kind of place where the smallest actions can carve out a permanent scar, while the smallest victories can feel like they mean everything. And when I think back to my time at Riverwood High, the one thing that always stands out is the shadow of Mr. Fisher, our literature teacher. Mr. Fisher wasn't just any teacher. He was the type who looked like he'd been defeated long before we ever met him. You could tell by the way he carried himself, disheveled, as though his best days were long behind him. His dream had been to be a writer, but somewhere along the line, that dream had withered. Instead of writing novels or short stories, he taught us about the writers who actually did make it, sitting at the front of the classroom, lecturing us with a bitterness that oozed from every word. You could practically see his unspoken resentment for his failure painted on his face every time he lectured about Hemingway or Faulkner, but it wasn't just his failure as a writer that made him so unbearable, it was his cruelty to Mr. Fisher didn't know how to encourage. He didn't know how to lift anyone up. His idea of teaching wasn't about fostering love for literature or creativity, it was about asserting power. About making us feel small so he could feel big. And he was good at it. I think that was his one talent, really, hurting us without ever laying a hand on us. It started with little things. He'd call someone out for something as innocuous as scratching their nose, making it seem like a grave offense. He'd humiliate people for their homework mistakes like they had committed a crime. He always had that smug look on his face when he did it, like he was pleased with himself for tearing someone down. But one moment stands out more than any other, because it was the moment I realized we were all just waiting for the right time to take him down. It was one of those cold, dreary mornings when you'd rather stay in bed, the kind of day that made you want to just stay under the covers and forget about the world outside. James and I were in the back row of Mr. Fisher's classroom, flipping through our notes from the last lesson. James had a weird habit of reading aloud to himself, even though he didn't make any noise. He'd just move his lips, sort of whispering the words under his breath as if trying to see if he could hear them. It didn't bother anyone. Hell, we were in a classroom full of people, each of us with our own distractions and quirks. It was just James. It wasn't a big deal, but to Mr. Fisher, it was. "James," he barked, his voice cutting through the room like an ice pick, "do you know there are places for people who talk to themselves? You should look into it." Everyone in the room went silent. It wasn't just the insult, it was the way he said it, like James was some kind of freak for something so harmless. You could see James shrink in his seat, the red creeping up his neck. I wanted to say something, anything to defend him, but Mr. Fisher had this way of making you feel small and helpless. That was his power. I could see it then, how Mr. Fisher thrived on that. The subtle cruelty. The emotional scarring that didn't leave a mark but lasted longer than any bruise ever would. It was like he knew exactly what to say to make you feel like the smallest person in the world. It wasn't just James, there was Leah, who had always been a bit of a rebel. She never backed down from anyone, until the day Mr. Fisher decided to pick on her. It happened a few weeks later. Leah came into class with a red mark on her arm, a small burn. She'd been victim to some sick prank where 3 of the boys in the class had thought it would be funny to glue her arm with hot glue while she wasn't paying attention. I remember the moment like it was yesterday. Leah was trying to hide it, but when Mr. Fisher saw, he didn't offer sympathy. He didn't even acknowledge how bad it was. Instead, he looked at her like she was an idiot. "You should be more careful, Leah," he said, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "If you can't even handle a little burn, what are you going to do when life gets harder? You're not smart enough to feel sorry for yourself over something so trivial." I saw Leah's face fall. She wasn't the kind of person who took shit from anyone, but that hit her like a freight train. It wasn't the burn on her arm that bothered her, it was the casual cruelty of it. She wasn't an idiot. She was hurt. But to Mr. Fisher, it didn't matter. He didn't care. That was it for me. That was when I knew we had to do something. A few days later, a group of us gathered in the library, whispering among ourselves. We weren't the only ones who had been hurt by him, and we knew we weren't the only ones who were fed up. The problem was, what could we do? What was the right kind of revenge for someone like Mr. Fisher, a man who made his life out of making other people miserable? And then, during lunch one day, it hit me that Mr. Fisher had this bizarre hatred for a hockey team, the Montreal Canadiens. He loathed them with a passion that didn't make sense. It was like some deep-seated vendetta he had against the team. He'd rant about them in class, calling their fans idiots, their players barbarians. I'd overheard him talking about it once, how, in his mind, the Canadiens embodied everything that was wrong with the world. He just couldn't let it go. It was his one passion, outside of literature, and it was the one thing that made him real, that made him feel like he mattered. That we didn't know why he hated them so much. But we didn't care that we took our revenge with the only weapon we had, stickers. James, Leah, and a few others in the group pooled their money together, buying every last Montreal Canadiens sticker they could find. And on the last day of that week, we put the plan into motion. We knew Mr. Fisher parked his car on the far side of the lot, far from the cameras and the prying eyes of the administration. He wasn't one to park in the fancy, well-monitored spots that the rest of the teachers used. He was too cheap, too stubborn, and so we went to work. It was like something out of a movie. We covered every inch of his car, the windows, the windshield, the mirrors, the bumper. We plastered them with Canadiens logos until there was nothing left of his car that didn't scream the team he hated. It wasn't just a few stickers, it was a full-on assault. That we made sure we did it in broad daylight, hoping he'd see it the moment he came out. The next day, the buzz in the school was electric. That Mr. Fisher's car was a disaster. The entire parking lot could see it from a mile away. There was no mistaking it. The whole school knew who was responsible, and yet, no one would admit it. No one cracked. The administration offered a reward, no homework for a month for anyone who could identify the culprits. But none of us took the bait. No one ever found out who did it. Not then. Not after graduation. Not even now. But the one thing I know is this: Mr. Fisher, the man who had spent years making other people feel small, never figured it out. He never knew who got him back. And for me, that was enough. As the weeks wore on, I could tell that Mr. Fisher was unraveling. His insults, though still biting, had lost some of their sharpness. There was a tremor in his voice whenever he spoke, a slight crack in the veneer of his authority. The class was quieter than usual, and I could see it in his eyes. The thrill of knowing that we had gotten away with it, that Mr. Fisher was out there, angry and clueless, gave me an odd sense of peace. There was no immediate fallout, no retaliation. The entire school had rallied behind the prank, and for once, we had the power. The collective silence was our strength. No one would break the code. But it wasn't until that one Tuesday morning, a month after the incident, that I realized just how deep the impact had been. It was the first class of the day, and as we shuffled into Mr. Fisher's room, a tension hung in the air, thick and palpable. He was standing at the front of the room, as usual, but there was something different in his posture today. His shoulders were hunched, his face pale and drawn. The wrinkles under his eyes were more pronounced, and his hands, usually so steady, trembled ever so slightly as he adjusted his papers on the desk. "Sit down," he growled, his voice low and rough, as though he hadn't slept in days. We did as we were told, quietly. The usual banter was absent. Even the students who'd once gleefully challenged him in class had fallen unusually silent. No one wanted to be the one to say something that might set him off. Who did it? Mr. Fisher finally spat, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the room. His voice was tight, as if the words were forced through clenched teeth. "Who put the stickers on my car?" A murmur rippled through the room, but no one answered. We all sat there, eyes forward, pretending we didn't hear the desperation in his voice. I could feel my pulse quicken, my stomach tighten with the anticipation of what was to come. Would he make a scene? Would he lash out at one of us, pick a scapegoat? But the class remained silent. Nobody moved. Fisher was becoming unhinged. He paced in front of the whiteboard, muttering to himself, his voice growing more frantic. I know it was one of you. You think this is funny, don't you? He stopped, his gaze settling on the class. You think you've won? At that moment, something inside me shifted. I realized just how powerless he had become. The power that he had wielded over us for so long, through ridicule, belittlement, and scorn, had evaporated. In his rage, he was small. Pathetic. Weak that we had done it. We had broken him. You think I don't know what this was about? He continued, his voice trembling with anger. You think you're clever? You think you can just do whatever you want, and there won't be consequences? I didn't answer. No one did. Mr. Fisher's hand clenched into a fist, his knuckles white. He slammed it onto the desk, making us all jump. I will find out who did this. And when I do, there will be hell to pay. I will make sure you regret it. But even as he threatened us, I could see the cracks in his facade. His words had no weight. The anger was there, but it lacked conviction. The bell rang, and the class stood up, but no one rushed out. We all filed out slowly, deliberately. As I passed him on my way out, I glanced at his face. He was standing there, still fuming, his mouth moving but no sound coming out. I realized then that he didn't know what to do. He was powerless. And I think that was the most beautiful thing I'd ever seen. 2 weeks later, the school had all but given up on finding the culprit. The reward was quietly rescinded, and the investigation was dropped. The power had shifted. Mr. Fisher was still the teacher, still the authority in the classroom, but he no longer commanded the respect he once had. The air of superiority he'd worn so easily had disappeared, replaced by the unease of someone who had been bested, humiliated by a group of students who had refused to be his punching bag any longer. One afternoon, as I walked out of class, I saw him standing by the door, staring out the window. He looked older than I'd ever seen him, his shoulders slumped, his hands shaking at his sides. For the first time, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't expected, pity, but it was brief. I didn't pity him for long, because in the end, we had won. And the victory was too sweet to be dulled by sympathy. The months passed. The school year came to a close, and we all moved on with our lives. Mr. Fisher remained a fixture in the halls, but he never spoke to me, or anyone else, in quite the same way. He didn't yell anymore. He didn't insult us in class. He had been broken, and it was obvious to everyone. Looking back, I sometimes think about what we did to him. Was it too much? Was it cruel to take such joy in his misery? But then I remember what he had done to us over the years, the way he made us feel small, inferior, incapable of standing up for ourselves. And I don't regret it. Not for a second. That he never found out who was behind the stickers. No one ever told him. And I think that made it hurt all the more, because sometimes, the sweetest revenge is the one that leaves no trace. The one that the person who deserves it will never see coming, the one that lingers in silence, and that's how it stayed. To this day, I still laugh about it. And I still remember, with a quiet sense of satisfaction, that we were the ones who got the last word.